So again, how an atheroma may be associated with a blood clot. We have a hypertensive person, and because of the high blood pressure, there are shearing forces on the endothelium and friction with the endothelium. There is endothelial damage, and there is deposition of fat, and that deposition of fat might form a swelling. That is the atheroma that causes a narrowing in the diameter. But that deposition of fat also triggers non-specific inflammatory cells to, like macrophages, for example, to come to the area to engulf the fat deposits. All this will result in the formation of a clot. How? Because we have two factors. The first factor is a rough endothelium, and the rough endothelium injures the platelets, and when the platelets are injured, they form a sticky substance, and they activate fibrin. So the sticky substance together with fibrin results in aggregation of blood cells, and the aggregation of the blood cells is the clot. So this is one mechanism, the clot forms, and the other mechanism the clot forms is through a narrow diameter, because a narrow diameter means stasis of blood, and stasis of blood favors the formation of a clot. Thank you, guys. I know you have a class now, so you can go to your class, and I'll be recording a 30-minute revision and then send the whole thing to you, inshallah, after having been done.
Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. And now I'll be starting the revision. So we're going to go backward and see how we could cover the most important topics that might be encountered on the test. I'll go slide by slide for 30 minutes and tell you what important things you have to be able to answer. Of course, first of all, you have to know the composition of the circulatory system, and you have to know that the circulatory system is more inclusive than the cardiovascular system, because the cardiovascular system is only the heart, blood vessels, and blood with all the blood components, but the circulatory system also includes the lymphatic system. Of course, we have to know what the lymphatic organs are. So you start by the lymph nodes, and then you have the tonsils here, you have the adenoids in the nasopharynx, you have the thymus behind the sternum, you have the lymphatic tissue in the spleen, you have pairs, patches in the small intestines that consist of aggregations of lymphatic cells. You have lymphatic collections in the appendix, and you have the bone marrow itself, because the tissue of the bone marrow contains white blood cells. Why do we need a circulatory system? Of course, because the circulatory system is a transport system with a pump. So you have a pump to pump blood, and that pump will make the blood circulate. And that blood is essential because it contains oxygen and nutrients. Like, why are oxygen and nutrients important? Because nutrients are broken down in the presence of oxygen to release the energy in the bonds, and to provide the cells with the energy that is necessary for the active processes. And at the same time, there is another part of the circulatory system that transports the wastes back to the heart and then to the lungs, so that we can get rid of the famous waste product, which is carbon dioxide. Now, the lymphatic system is important because of two things. Number one, the lymphatic vessels carry the excessive fluid that is not carried by the veins. And number two, because of the lymphatic organs that contain the white blood cells that are important for fighting of pathogens. Another important question here is, why do higher complex organisms like human being require a circulatory system more than simpler organisms? Because when simpler organisms require oxygen, they are made of a very small number of cells. For example, if they are unicellular or simple multicellular, then they can take oxygen from their environment by simple diffusion. And similarly, they can get rid of carbon dioxide by simple diffusion. But if you are a complex multicellular organism, then there will be deeper cells, and it will be very difficult for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across the millions or even trillions of cells that are present in your body in order to reach a particular destination. So the presence of a transport system with blood vessels and with fluids inside the blood vessel would be extremely important for rapid arrival of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients to their destination. Now, the transport system requires three main conditions. The first one is the presence of a pump to generate the motive force. Number two, the presence of a fluid, whether blood or lymph, in order for substances to be dissolved inside. And number three, the presence of blood vessels to prevent, in a closed system, preferably, to prevent leakage of that blood. And in the most highly developed circulatory systems, we have a capillary system, and that capillary system is important because it has fenestrations that will regulate the exudation of some of the fluid components of the blood and getting them back at the venous side. And we will see this in detail later on. Of course, the anatomy of the heart is important. It lies, if I ever ask you to describe the anatomy of the heart, you would say that it lies between the two lungs and the base. It is very important to know that the base of the heart rests on the diaphragm, and to know that the axis of the heart is directed downwards and to the left towards the apex. It is important to be able to know whether the heart is enlarged or not when having an X-ray. So, for example, if I ever ask you to I give you an X-ray and ask you whether the heart is enlarged or not. So what you're going to do is to divide or to draw the middle line, and then you choose the most prominent parts of the heart on both sides, on both borders, the right border and the left border, even if they are not on the same horizontal line. And then you draw a horizontal here and a horizontal segment there. And then you add up the width of parts A and B. And then you come here to the broadest diameter of the thorax or of the chest cavity, not necessarily at the level of the diaphragm. It is usually above the level of the diaphragm. If I call this CD, then A plus B should always be less than 50% of C plus D. So it should be smaller than C plus D over 2. It's also important to know the lobes of the lung and how we visualize them, although this is something that is related to the respiratory system, but we studied it with the cardiovascular system. It is important to know that the right middle lobe is broad anteriorly and it has an apex posteriorly. So if you look anteriorly, you will be able to see the right middle lobe. But if you look posteriorly, you will see only the apex. So if you look at the anterior border of the lung, you can see the upper lobe, the middle lobe only, and you cannot see the lower lobe that is most posterior. If you look laterally, you can see, if you look laterally, like here, you can see the upper lobe, you can see the middle lobe, and you can see the lower lobe if you look laterally. But if you look anteriorly, from this anterior part, you can just see the upper lobe and the middle lobe, and you cannot see the lower lobe because it is posteriorly. It lies posteriorly. Of course, the ribs have been discussed before, but it is important here to know certain anatomical landmarks, for example, the sternal notch and the sternal angle. And this bone we call the manubrium sterni because if you scroll your index finger down and find the this notch and then scroll it further down and find the angle, then in front, a little bit lower than the sternal angle, you will find the second intercostal space. And the second intercostal space lies between the second rib above and the third rib below. The second intercostal space is extremely important because this is where, on both sides, by the way. So here we have the second intercostal space to the left, where you can hear the pulmonary sounds. And there is the second intercostal space to the right, where you can hear the aortic sounds. And here, if we descend furthermore at the mid-clavicular line in the fifth intercostal space, so this is the first intercostal, second intercostal, third intercostal, fourth and fifth, then here there will be the apex of the heart. So if you want to know where the apex of the heart lies, then the apex of the heart will lie in the fifth left, and you have to say the fifth left intercostal space in the left mid-clavicular line. In the same fifth left intercostal space, but at the left sternal border, you will have the tricuspid area. By the way, this is the site of the apex, but meanwhile, this is the site where you can hear any murmur that is related to the mitral valve. You can best hear the murmurs that are related to the mitral valve in that area. Mitralization of the left border of the heart is an X-ray finding, and this simply means that instead of having, if you look here, for example, you will find that this is the left atrium and this is the left ventricle, and here we have like a concavity between the left atrium, or the auricle of the left atrium, and the left ventricle. If that concavity does not exist and the border is more or less straightened, then this is what we call mitralization. So what's meant by mitralization of the left border of the heart? It is straightening of the left border of the heart because of enlargement of the left atrium. It is also important to know whether the X-ray picture has been taken in the proper breathing phase, meaning that it has to be taken at the end of inspiration. So before estimating the size of the heart and whether the size of the heart is normal, and whether, by the way, we call this the cardiothoracic ratio, which should be less than a half, the cardiothoracic ratio. This is very important. So the cardiothoracic ratio should be less than a half. But before doing this, you should make sure that the X-ray has been taken at the right timing. So in such a case, you have to see the position of the diaphragm. The diaphragm, if the picture is really taken at the end of inspiration, the diaphragm should be at the level of the 8th to 10th posterior rib, or the 5th to 6th anterior rib. And the clavicles should be symmetrical, should appear symmetrical. Let's look at the X-ray. So here, if you count the ribs, so this is I can barely see the first rib. I think this is the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, maybe this is the ninth. So the diaphragm is almost between the ninth and 10th. If we look posteriorly, if we look at the ribs posteriorly, yes, I can see the anterior part of the ribs. I'm not sure, the ribs are not very clear here, but this, no, I'll erase, guys, I'm sorry. I'll erase, because if we look here, the ones that the ribs, the part of the ribs that is, if you look at the thoracic cage here, you see? So the ribs, the posterior part of the ribs is inclined like that, okay? And the anterior part of the ribs is inclined like that. So if we look at the X-ray again, where is it? Actually, it's not very clear. The X-ray is not very clear, but you have to count the ribs and the posterior part of the ribs. If you are counting the posterior part of the ribs, which are inclined like this, then the diaphragm should be at the level of the 8th to 10. I'm sorry, because the ribs, maybe I do not see them well, but maybe they are clear, but I'm not able to differentiate between the posterior and anterior parts of the ribs. We've talked about the cardiothoracic ratio, and if the cardiothoracic ratio is increased, meaning that if it is more than half the total width of the diaphragm, then it refers to either cardiomegaly, meaning that the heart itself is enlarged, or to pericardial effusion, meaning that there is abnormal accumulation of fluid, abnormal accumulation of fluid in the pericardial sac. Of course, in a normal heart X-ray, just like in a normal chest X-ray, you have to give a comment about the cardiophrenic angle, the angle between the heart and the diaphragm. This is not the cardiothoracic, this is not the angle between the ribs and the diaphragm, but it is the angle between the heart and the diaphragm. So the cardiophrenic angle is this one, and you have to give information about the cardiophrenic angle, this cardiophrenic angle. But the other angle, I'm talking about the angle between the diaphragm and the chest wall, is that one, and it has to be clear, otherwise it might be an indication of pleural effusion. So the cardiophrenic angle is the angle between the heart and the diaphragm, and that angle should be, as you have seen, an acute angle. You also have to know what the anterior surface of the heart is formed of. And as you can see, it is mainly formed by the right atrium and the right ventricle, because during embryonic development, there is twisting of the heart, and this makes the left ventricle and the left atrium rather be more posterior. So if I ever ask you to complete a statement, for example, the anterior surface of the heart is formed mainly of the right atrium and the right ventricle. Whereas or you might be asked to label, I might get you that diagram, for example, X-ray diagram, and ask you to label the structure. So here you would say this is the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left ventricle. So from right to left, from right of the patient to the left of the patient, you have right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. And then above you have here, of course, this is the superior vena cava, and then the aorta is to the left of the pulmonary artery because of the oblique ascent of the aorta. And on the other side, on the other hand, you have the pulmonary artery to the rightmost because they crisscross each other. And that's why you can hear the pulmonary sounds on the left side of the patient, whereas you can hear the aortic sounds on the right side of the patient. So from right to left, you have superior vena cava, and then you have the aorta, and then you have the pulmonary artery. If you have, on the other hand, a lateral view of the X-ray, then you will mostly see the left ventricle and the left atrium. This is important to know. Of course, the pericardium and the function of the pericardium to protect the heart and to secrete a fluid that prevents friction between the two layers of the pericardium is also important. You have to know that excessive accumulation of fluid in the pericardium is called pericardial effusion, and it is one cause of increased cardiothoracic ratio. Of course, it is very important to know the structures of the heart. I might ask you a very primitive question, just like getting you this diagram and asking you, for example, about this structure. You would say the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the right atrium. Notice, of course, that again, the axis of the heart is oblique to the left, that the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava are on the same line. Notice that the aorta is more to the right and the pulmonary artery is more to the left. And here we have two pulmonary vein branches on the left side and two other branches on the right side, but they all pour in the left atrium, which we can hardly see or barely see here. And then we have the left ventricle. So it's important to know the basic anatomy of the heart and, of course, the basic anatomy of the valve. So you are supposed to know that this is, for example, the tricuspid valve. This is the mitral or bicuspid valve. This is the pulmonary valve, and this is the aortic valve. You have to know the function of the valve. Every time you mention the function of a valve, you have to say that it allows the passage of so and so, for example, oxygenated blood. I'll give you an example. If I talk about the tricuspid valve, then I would say allows the passage of deoxygenated blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle during diastole and prevents backflow during systole. So it's actually 8 points. Allows what kind of blood to pass from what to what, in which phase of the cardiac cycle, and prevents backflow during which phase of the cardiac cycle. And you can apply this to all valves that you are dealing with. Okay, and of course, you have to know the alveolo-capillary exchange. You know the structure of the capillaries. They have fenestrations. They are thin-walled because they are made of one layer of endothelial cells. They do not have smooth muscles in their wall. and at the air sacs, they receive oxygen from the air sacs and give back carbon dioxide and water vapor. The purpose of the alveolo-capillary exchange that occurs as part of the pulmonary circulation, it is important to know that the alveolo-capillary exchange is part of the pulmonary circulation. The purpose is to unload the blood from carbon dioxide and load it with oxygen. And then you have to know, of course, that the sinoatrial node is the pacemaker of the heart. I might ask you why. So you would say that it has an unstable membrane potential, meaning that it can fire or depolarize on its own. So that's why it can be the pacemaker of the heart, but this is not the only reason why it is the pacemaker of the heart. There is another reason, which is it can control the rate of all the parts of the heart. Why? Because there are other foci in the heart that can fire on their own, like the atrioventricular node, but the highest rate is that of the sinoatrial node. So the characteristics of the SA node that allow it to be the pacemaker of the heart is that it can depolarize on its own, having or possessing an unstable membrane potential, and meanwhile, it has the highest rate of depolarization. When this wave of depolarization spreads over the area, over the atria, all the atrial muscles get depolarized and then they start contracting. Okay, so I might ask you about the origin of the P wave. The P wave results from spread of the wave of depolarization over the atrial muscles. And then depolarization is transmitted via the AV node to the ventricles. So I might ask you about the PR segment and the PR interval. Of course, you know that the PR interval is more inclusive because it includes the PR segment in addition to the P wave. The PR segment represents the time. It is, of course, the duration of time between the end of the P wave and the beginning of the QRS complex. So it represents conduction via the AV node, and therefore it might be prolonged if the AV node is diseased. Meanwhile, the PR interval is the duration between the beginning of the P wave and the beginning of the QRS complex, and therefore, what does it represent? If I ask you, it represents the time needed for the electrical wave of depolarization to spread over the atria and to be transmitted to the ventricles. The function of the AV node, what's the function of the AV node? It is delay and relay. So it delays, meaning that it is slower in conduction than the SA node, and therefore this delay in conduction allows a certain fraction of a second for the ventricles to relax and to have enough time to receive blood from the atria. This is the first benefit. The second benefit is that it prevents the simultaneous contraction of the atria and the ventricles, and which would result in an inefficient action of the heart. The SA node can the AV node be the pacemaker of the heart? Yes, in which case we would have an AV nodal rhythm with an absent P wave or an inverted P wave, and we would have a slow cardiac rhythm. This might happen if the SA node is diseased. Why inverted P wave? Because the focus in the AV node, and therefore atrial depolarization will arise from below and move upward. Why sometimes invisible? Because it is delayed, so it is masked by the QRS complex. Thank you, guys. We will, inshallah, finish our revision on Saturday after having finished the curriculum or the system. Thank you.